In the heart of British Columbia's central coast, within its steep-sided valleys and deep fjords, lies the homeland of the Nuxalk people. Since time immemorial, they have inhabited this territory, a landscape rich in both resources and spiritual meaning. Their identity is inextricably woven into the Bella Coola Valley and its surrounding regions, a connection affirmed in their very name. The term Bella Coola, often used historically and in academic writing, is in fact an exonym, derived from a word in the Heiltsuk language meaning stranger. The people themselves prefer the name Nuksulk, a term that refers to the valley itself and signifies their inseparable relationship with their homeland. Their language, ItNuxalk, is a unique and geographically isolated branch of the larger Salishan family, distinguishing them from their Wakashan and Dene neighbors. This report will argue that the Nuksalk nation stands as a powerful model of indigenous resilience and sovereignty, demonstrating an unbroken continuity of law, governance, and identity rooted in their sacred origin stories, Smallpox, and their profound, never-ceded relationship with their ancestral territory, Heiltsuk. This continuity informs every aspect of their history, from pre-contact society through modern challenges, resistance to colonialism, cultural revitalization, and the development of a sustainable, conservation-based economy. The Nuksalk narrative is one of extraordinary survival in the face of demographic catastrophe, the assertion of ancestral law in the face of colonial encroachment, and a holistic rebuilding of the nation based on the principles that have sustained them since the beginning of time. To provide a framework for this complex narrative, this report will trace the legal foundations of the Smallpox, explore the vibrant traditional Nuksalk society, chronicle the catastrophe of colonialism, analyze the modern assertion of sovereignty at ISTA, and finally, examine contemporary efforts in healing, revitalization, and stewardship. Through this lens, the Nuksalk story emerges not as a relic of the past, but as a living, sovereign political and cultural entity actively shaping its own future. The core Nuksalk creation narrative begins with the creator, Alquantum, who presides over the sun and all things. At the beginning of time, Alquantum created the 4 supernatural carpenters, Masalanieks, and tasked them with carving the first human beings inside the creator's celestial house, Nuzmata, the house of Smayasta. It was here that the original 45 Nuksalk ancestral families were formed. Each family was given a tunwas, a spirit, a sluptasta, a breath, and crucially, a nuslichwata, a treasure box. This treasure box was not just a physical container, but a metaphysical repository of each lineage's rights and identity, containing their squatsta, names, asulchits, provisions and tools, stlchu, code of ethics, and shyakhu, protocols. The foundational legal act in Nuksalk law is the descent of these 45 ancestors from Nuzmata, donning cloaks that became their family crests, e.g. grizzly bear, raven, eagle. They descended to specific mountain peaks within Nuksalk territory. Upon their arrival, their cloaks returned to Nuzmata, but the rights contained in their nuslichata remained. Each family then journeyed from their mountain peak to establish villages in the valleys below. This act of ancestral descent is the crucial moment that forms the basis of Nuksalk land title. It creates an inseparable and perpetual legal link between a specific family lineage, a specific geographic territory, and the divine authority of the creator. Nuksalk land title is therefore not a Western concept of property ownership, but a sacred responsibility inherited directly from Alquantum. The entire Nuksalk territory, known as Kuhumtsil, is thus mapped and allocated according to the Smayasta of the 45 original families. The traditional Nuksalk system of governance is centered on the Staltmc, or the hereditary chiefs. Each family lineage has a Staltmc who is responsible for upholding the Nuksalk laws contained in their Smayasta and managing their ancestral territory. These leaders meet in the House of Smayasta, the Nuksalk legislative and judicial body. It is here that major decisions are made, disputes are resolved, and the law is reaffirmed. This system stands in contrast to the Indian Act Band Council structure imposed by the Canadian government, which operates under federal authority and primarily administers affairs within the confines of small reserves. The authority of the Staltmc derives from the Smayasta and their connection to the land, not from colonial statute.
In the Nuksalk worldview, art, ceremony, and law are inseparable. Masks, regalia, and totem poles are not mere decorative objects. They are the physical manifestations of the Smayusta and function as living legal documents. When a mask representing a supernatural being from a family's Smayusta is danced in a potlatch, it is a public assertion of that family's rights, privileges, and territorial claims. The crests carved on a totem pole recount a lineage's legal history and its relationship to the land. The Snuxus, sun mask in particular, holds national significance. Its design, featuring 4 carpenters and 40 fingers, visually documents and ratifies the historic amalgamation of the surviving lineages after the smallpox epidemic, uniting the 4 Nuksalk territories into one unified nation. Each piece of art is thus a statement of jurisdiction, a visual proclamation of Nuksalk law and order. This profound link between law, land, and identity highlights the fundamental chasm between the Nuksalk and Canadian legal systems. Nuksalk law, rooted in divine origin, asserted through oral history and ratified through public ceremony, operates from a completely different premise than Canadian law, which is based on written documents, the sovereignty of the Crown, and the concept that Aboriginal rights are an encumbrance to be negotiated and extinguished through treaty. The Nuksalk assert that their title is absolute and pre-existing, never surrendered through war or treaty. Consequently, they have consistently rejected the BC treaty process because, from their legal perspective, there is nothing to negotiate. They are already the legitimate government of their homeland. Conflicts like the ISTA blockade, therefore, must be understood not as protests within the Canadian system, but as jurisdictional disputes between 2 sovereign legal orders. This understanding, in turn, reframes the importance of repatriation. The fight to bring home cultural treasures like the echo mask and totem poles is not just about recovering artifacts, it is an act of legal and political restoration. Because these items are the physical embodiment of the Smayusta and of title, their removal to museums was an act of legal dispossession, physically separating the evidence of Nuksalk law from the people and the land. When a mask cannot be danced in a potlatch, the legal process of ratifying the rights it represents is disrupted. The return of these items is therefore a reassertion of Nuksalk legal authority and a crucial step in rebuilding the instruments of governance of the House of Smayusta. Bringing home a totem pole is tantamount to recovering a stolen title deed or constitutional document. Prior to the arrival of Europeans, the Nuxalkmc lived in a world of abundance, sustained by the rich ecosystems of Kulhulemuk. Their society was highly structured, their economy dynamic, and their ceremonial life intricate, all centered around the institution of the potlatch. Nuksalk society was traditionally hierarchical, divided into 3 main classes: nobility, commoners, and enslaved individuals. The nobility consisted of the hereditary chiefs and their families, whose status derived from their direct lineage to the first ancestors who descended from Nusmata. Commoners made up the majority of the population, and enslaved individuals, typically captured in warfare, were at the lowest tier. Despite this stratified structure, social mobility was possible. Through wealth, skill, or strategic marriage, one could elevate their status. Kinship was based on lineal descent, and the basic social unit was the large, extended household. Multiple families would live together in massive cedar plank houses, which served as the centers of both economic and ceremonial life. The potlatch was the primary economic, political, and social institution in Nuksalk life. Far from being a simple feast, it was a complex ceremonial arena where laws were upheld, status was validated, and wealth was redistributed. Potlatches were held to mark significant life events, births, namings, marriages, and deaths, and to ratify the transfer of hereditary privileges and titles. A host would invite guests from neighboring villages and even other nations to witness and validate their claims. During the ceremony, the host would display their wealth, the masks, blankets, songs, and dances inherited through their smeyusta, and then distribute lavish amounts of property to their guests. This act of giving was the core of the potlatch. A chief's status was measured not by what they accumulated, but by what they gave away. This mechanism functioned as a sophisticated economic system that was fundamentally at odds with capitalism. Instead of encouraging the accumulation of private wealth, the potlatch ensured that resources were periodically redistributed throughout the society, strengthening social bonds and preventing extreme economic disparity. It was a system built on reciprocity and collective obligation. The Canadian government's ban on the potlatch in 1884, therefore, was more than an act of cultural suppression. It was a direct assault on the Nuksalk economic and political order. By outlawing their primary redistributive mechanism, the colonial government sought to dismantle the indigenous economic system and impose a model based on private property, wage labor, and individual accumulation, thereby undermining Nuksalk collective governance and land tenure. The Nuksalk economy was based on a deep understanding of the seasonal cycles of Kulhulemuk. They were expert fishers, hunters, and gatherers. The rivers teemed with various species of salmon, and the forests provided mountain goats, whose wool was woven into valuable blankets, as well as other game. Of all the resources, however, none was more economically and culturally vital than the sput, or Yulakan fish. This small, oil-rich fish would return to the Nuksalk rivers in massive numbers each spring, providing crucial sustenance after the long winter. The Nuksalk had perfected the process of rendering the precious oil from these fish to create Yulakan grease, a nutrient-dense and highly prized substance. This grease was not just a dietary staple, it was a primary commodity that fueled an extensive trade network known as the grease trails. These ancient trails stretched from the coast far into the interior, connecting the Nuksalk with nations like the Dekalk and Tilsequatan. Yulakan grease, which could only be produced on specific coastal rivers, was highly sought after by interior peoples. This trade was more than a commercial transaction. It was a form of diplomacy and geopolitical currency. Nuksalk control over the production and distribution of this strategic resource gave them significant influence and power in their intertribal relations. The grease trails were the arteries of diplomacy, alliance building, and cultural exchange. The collapse of the Yulakan population in the 20th century was therefore not just an ecological and nutritional disaster, it was also a devastating blow to the Nuksalk's traditional geopolitical standing and their ability to maintain these ancient networks.
The history of the Nuksalk nation is indelibly divided into two epochs, the world of abundance before contact and the world after, forever altered by the catastrophe of colonialism. The single most devastating event was the smallpox epidemic of 1862, a cataclysm that nearly annihilated the Nuxalkmc and paved the way for the dispossession of their homeland. Before the arrival of Europeans, Nuksalk territory was a bustling and densely populated place. Pre-contact population estimates vary, with some historians and Nuksalk oral traditions suggesting figures as high as 35,000 to 60,000 people. These people lived in over 70 active villages spread across four main ancestral territories, or Tkamatl: Ista Suchaham, Dene Inlet; Nuxalkmc, Bella Coola Valley; Qualnamik, Quatna; and Tulyumik, South Inlet. This was a large, dynamic, and politically complex society with extensive networks of trade, kinship, and ceremony connecting their villages. In March 1862, a steamship named the Brother Jonathan arrived in Victoria, carrying a gold miner from California infected with smallpox. The virus quickly spread to the crowded indigenous camps surrounding the colonial fort. Instead of enacting a quarantine or initiating a mass vaccination program, measures that were available and known to the colonial authorities, the government took a different course. They began to forcibly evict the infected indigenous people, burning their camps and ordering them to return to their home villages up and down the coast. British gunboats even escorted the canoes to ensure they left, effectively turning the fleeing people into vectors of disease. Many historians and Nuksulk leaders now view this action not as negligence, but as a deliberate act of ethnic cleansing, designed to clear the land for colonial settlement. The epidemic swept through the Nuxalk communities with unimaginable ferocity. With no natural immunity to the virus, people died in massive numbers. Within 2 years, the Nuxalk population plummeted by over 90%, from tens of thousands to only about 300 survivors by 1864. Once thriving villages fell silent and entire lineages were wiped out. This catastrophe was more than a tragedy, it was the primary mechanism of land dispossession. By effectively emptying the land, the epidemic allowed the colonial government and settlers to advance a narrative of terra nullius, a land belonging to no one, and occupy vast Nuxalk territories without the need for treaty or purchase. The arrival of Norwegian settlers in 1894, who were granted farmland in the valley, is a direct example of this process. The subsequent imposition of the small, restrictive reserve system was not an act of protection, but the legal consolidation of a massive land theft facilitated by what many considered to have been biological warfare. In the face of annihilation, the remaining Nuxalk survivors undertook a strategic act of political survival. Under the leadership of figures like Chief Putlas, the survivors from the more than 70 villages abandoned their ancestral homes and gathered at a single location, Kutchis, at the mouth of the Bella Coola River. This was not a mere clustering of refugees, it was a deliberate reforging of the Nuxalk nation. Chief Putlas strategically married 11 high-ranking women from different surviving lineages.